and an Indian perspective as to what's happening in the world's coal markets. As I said earlier, India is an incredibly important country in global energy, and especially for coal. Indeed, India is a very important country when it comes to global affairs, given that India's large coal consumption was a key factor of discussion at the COP21 climate change negotiations in Paris late last year. As I mentioned before, both the World Coal Association chairman and myself have been in India for the last week, meeting senior government and industry representatives. On Friday night, in fact, we were very privileged to welcome the Coal Preparation Society of India in as our newest member, which Dr. Purty, who is chairing this morning's session, also chairs. So we were very proud to welcome the Coal Preparation Society as our newest member here from India. I'll begin by looking globally at what's happening in the world's energy mix. We are an energy-hungry planet. In any scenario, even the most ambitious climate scenario, demand for energy will grow across the world. And that's because energy is a driver of economic development. But growing energy demand also means that we need to look at the environmental solutions, especially for fossil fuels. And coal will continue to play a very significant role in the world's energy mix for many decades to come. At a global level, we hear a lot about radical transformations, and there will be. Renewables will grow dramatically. They'll play a very significantly increased role in the world's energy mix. But in some senses, when I look at a slide like this one and a graph like this one, I think it's almost a case of the more things change, the more they stay the same. In the IEA's new policy scenario, which is their central scenario, we see energy demand across the world roughly split into quarters in 2040. Coal will still be there. It may have a slightly smaller share than it does today, but it's actually bigger in absolute size than it is today. So the world's energy mix from a primary energy perspective will be roughly divided into 4 quarters: coal, oil, gas, and low emission sources of energy such as renewables and nuclear. That means that we must recognise that coal will play a very significant role in the world's energy mix for decades to come, and therefore it must be part of the solutions that we look for to address environmental challenges such as climate change. Much of the demand for coal is driven by what happens in Asia for the decades to come. In the year 2000, the Asian share of global coal power generation capacity was roughly about 38% of global capacity. Today it's 69%. And when we look towards 2040, when we look at all of the power plants that are planned for construction around the world, by 2040, Asia will comprise 77%, that's more than 3/4 of the world's coal-fired power generation capacity. This will drive significant demand for coal. There will be huge growth in power generation capacity from coal in India and indeed across Southeast Asia. That means that debates about energy and climate change that ignore the shift of coal towards Asia and that are focused on renewable deployment, particularly in Europe, and shale gas in North America, ignore some of the key challenges that we face internationally to reduce emissions from all fossil fuels, but particularly from coal. There is a bit of a perception driven around the world by policymakers in Europe and North America that because of the shift to renewables and the increasing deployment of renewables in Europe, which has been heavily driven by government subsidy, and by the increase in shale gas in the US, which has been driven by technology change, that transformation can happen elsewhere in the world. Whereas actually what we see is a very significant increase in growth of demand for coal across developing and emerging Asia. But coal isn't going away in OECD countries either. Coal will still have a role in Europe in 2040, and according to President Obama's Clean Power Plan, coal will still provide 27% of the electricity in the US in 2030, which is only down a little from today's share of about 33%. So we shouldn't be told that coal is going away in the OECD and only is a fuel for developing and emerging Asia. While it is true that coal plays a big role in developing and emerging Asia, it still has a role to play in OECD countries. As you can see from this table, China, India, and Indonesia, they dominate in terms of new coal plant capacity. In fact, they make up about 71% of the total coal-fired power generation capacity currently under construction. The Philippines, Vietnam, Turkey, and Pakistan bring that total up to about 81%. So it does show that coal will play a bigger role and is increasing and huge growth in renewables and in coal in India. This is because India is the major emerging economy in the world today. It is urbanizing at a rapid pace, but it is also industrializing, even in an economy that is highly service-driven. Coal's major role in India leads people to ask about the environmental and climate impacts. And so I think it is important that we look at these. India is currently adding roughly 20 gigawatts of new coal-fired power generation capacity every year. In fact, research by the World Coal Association shows that over the next couple of decades, roughly 292 gigawatts of new coal-fired power generation is planned for construction. And that's why in India's INDC, the climate commitment that the government of India made to the Paris climate negotiations, they made it very clear that coal is the backbone of the electricity mix here for many decades to come. But that's also why the Indian government in their INDC highlighted the very important role that high-efficiency, low-emissions power generation using supercritical and ultra-supercritical technology will play in achieving India's twin objectives, and that is improving energy access and improving the access to affordable energy, but also by reducing emissions and using coal in an environmentally conscious way. And that's why we believe that it's very important that here in India you do focus on the role for supercritical and ultra-supercritical technology. Using the right coal technology is absolutely essential. Modern, high-efficiency, low-emission power plants, supercritical and ultra-supercritical technology, can reduce emissions from coal by 25 to 33% compared to older, less efficient technology. Importantly, efficient power generation from coal using these technologies is an important first step for the future deployment of carbon capture and storage. This is technology, though, that can be deployed today. Supercritical and ultra-supercritical power plants are available commercially today. That's why India isn't alone amongst the countries that submitted in their INDCs a commitment to focus on high-efficiency, low-emissions coal. In fact, there were roughly 20 countries, most of them throughout Asia, who said, we are going to focus on deploying high-efficiency, low-emissions coal as part of their action on climate change. Indeed, India's 13th five-year plan calls for a focus on supercritical technology, and there are very good reasons for this. Late last year, the World Coal Association released a report called India's Energy Trilemma. It looks at the role of high-efficiency, low-emissions coal in India. The report shows that if India moved its current planning pipeline for coal-fired power generation, that's everything that's planned today, towards exclusively using ultra-supercritical technology, that would save roughly 11 billion tonnes of carbon dioxide emissions. Very significant number in a global context. It's roughly the same as building 65,000 wind turbines or taking 500,000 cars off the road. This is the environmental impact that you can have by focusing on moving away from the least efficient, older subcritical plants towards modern, high-efficiency, low-emission power generation from coal. Now, as I mentioned before, India has legitimate twin priorities: energy access and environmental and climate protection. India needs to find a solution for both. And that's why I think it's very important that we look in a little bit more detail about the benefits of high efficiency, low emissions coal. As an example, the research that we did for this report that we released last year imagined that we just had $1 billion to spend here. If it was spent on subcritical power generation in India, India would get significant new power generation capacity, but it would come with high emissions. If we spent that $1 billion on solar here in India, we would obviously achieve very significant emissions reductions, but we'd only achieve about a quarter of the power generation of using subcritical coal. But with ultra-supercritical, you can achieve almost the same amount of power generation as subcritical, but you can also achieve about 2/3 of the emission savings that you would by spending that $1 billion on solar. The analysis that we did also shows that from a global perspective, if you decided to spend that same $1 billion on renewables in Europe, for example, you'd actually achieve less global emissions reductions than by spending it on the most advanced coal technology here in India. That's a very important lesson to remember for how the global community makes decisions around things like climate financing. It shows that India can achieve increased energy access from building new coal, but also by building the right coal technology can achieve very significant emissions reductions. That's why at the World Coal Association earlier last year, we released a concept paper for a global platform to accelerate coal efficiency, or for short, PACE. The idea would be an international platform to help drive the deployment of the most efficient coal technologies in developing and emerging countries. It would be a public-private partnership to overcome the financial, technical and regulatory barriers to deploying modern high-efficiency coal. I'm pleased to say that I've been having discussions over the last couple of days here in India with people from government and other organisations about how a concept like PACE might work. And indeed, we'll be having further such meetings later this week in Indonesia. I'd also like for a moment to touch on the role of gas. This is obviously the World PetroCoal Congress that is talking about a role for gas. And it is important because gas will play a very significant role in many economies around the world. But we often get told that gas should replace coal because it has a lower emissions profile. And that is true in some respects. But in India, as in many other Asian economies, there are significant challenges with deploying gas, particularly at a large scale. In fact, in many of those economies, coal is likely to replace gas rather than be replaced by gas. Of course, the capital cost of gas plants is lower, but fuel costs for gas plants in India and across much of Asia are actually higher than they are for coal. And in India in particular, gas tends to operate at a much lower load factor. It's for those reasons that our research shows that in fact the avoided cost of carbon dioxide by switching from less efficient coal to gas is actually higher than the avoided cost of switching from less efficient coal to ultra-supercritical coal, HELE coal. And it also shows that in 2035, the levelized cost of electricity, that is the measure that takes into account capital costs and fuel costs and all other costs, actually show that gas in India is significantly still more expensive than it is for coal. So finally, to give you a sense of the World Coal Association's view, we must recognise that coal is an important driver of affordable, reliable energy to support the economic development and competitiveness of the world's economies. Coal plays a major role in industrialising and urbanising economies. In fact, in any scenario, coal is still going to play a big role in the world's energy mix, particularly in Asia and countries like India. But we can significantly reduce emissions from coal with technology that is commercially available today. That is the high efficiency, low emissions technology. We should encourage countries to support the deployment of high efficiency, low emissions coal. We should recognise that part of the Paris Agreement specifically recognised through the INDCs that high efficiency, low emissions coal is a key part of achieving the world's climate objectives. High efficiency, low emissions coal, as I mentioned, is also an important first step towards the future deployment of carbon capture and storage. But more public support is needed to increase the commercial ability of CCS to operate. I believe that in the developed world, we need to focus on driving the cost of CCS down so that it can be deployed in the future in countries like India. And that's why it's important to support the deployment of high-efficiency coal today, because it makes that future deployment of CCS much more affordable. So I believe that we need, as an international community, to support India to achieve its twin objectives of energy access and economic development, along with improved environmental performance and reducing emissions from coal. Coal will play a very big role in India's energy mix for the many decades to come. And as an international community, we need to be supporting that. So thank you very much.